get started.
Well, welcome to another episode Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with Tim.
Hi, guys. My name is Timothy James. I'm the collections manager and lead researcher here at the World Fossil Finders Museum. I'm an archaeologist and a paleontologist. I'm really happy to be joining the show today.
Well, I was coming in with a whole other question. I was going to ask how you got started into dinosaurs.
Ooh, that's a good question. I've always kind of been a big fan of dinosaurs. I would describe myself as one of those kids that had a big dinosaur obsession as a toddler and never quite grew out of it. So I was practically raised by the New Mexico Museum of Natural History in Albuquerque. So
Never
it's
lose
always
your
kind
inner
of
dinosaur is the best advice I've ever heard in my life.
amen to that, man. I think on the same scale, we should just always remember never lose our curiosity. Like that's when I think people become jaded and old, is when they lose their curiosity. And that's the cool thing about working with paleontology is every day is a new mystery and every day is a new problem to be solved. So.
What do you consider, I guess, through your work, or maybe even just diving down the realm of paleontology, even when it started? What is the biggest fascination? Like everybody's got a favorite dinosaur, but what really sparks your curiosity here? Because like we've all seen Jurassic World. I thought that was going to be your answer of why you liked it so much, but I think it's a lot that like they show us these prehistoric creatures that are kind of coming out of, I mean, just mostly child's movies and movies when we're young, but they don't really get a whole lot of explanation. And the fact of going to a museum, I mean, I wish I had a time machine to go back in time to when I was a kid going to these museums and actually took it in rather than just fucked around with the woolly mammoth or something. Like it was never something like I really kind of understood until I started talking to people that were involved in paleontology and finding the fossils. Like here, people are like, what are you, Indiana Jones? That may be true on some accounts, but it's a lot more than that. You're predating things
Mhm.
that have been extinct for so freaking long that we wouldn't even know existed. Most people don't even know exist.
It's true, yeah. So one of the most fascinating things about paleontology for me is how little we actually know about the past. So unlike archaeology or unlike geology or any of the other natural sciences, paleontology is what we call an infantile science. So this science is actually only about 200 years old, which sounds like a lot, but it's actually really not. So what we're still doing is we're still trying to figure out the different phylogenies, which is a fancy way of saying the braided stream or evolutionary tree that makes up different animals' backgrounds. So, for example, a lot of my research is focused on elephants, primarily Gomphotheres, which are the earliest elephants in North America. And the cool thing about them is they were the most successful elephants that ever existed. So what happened is, at the end of the Eocene period, you start to see these interesting, uh, very basal proboscideans proboscideans, just a fancy way of saying elephants, by the way. You start to see these very basal proboscideans coming out of Egypt. And then all of a sudden, you just see this huge adaptive radiation, which means that all these animals built new traits, and these new traits allow them to really dominate the environment they're in. So I study Gomphotheres because they're the first elephants, and after this adaptive radiation, we get the elephant known as Gomphotherium productum. Now, when I was in Albuquerque, I was actually lucky enough to get to work with some of the best preserved specimens of this species in Espanola, New Mexico. And it was really significant to get to work with them because they persisted in the Espanola Basin for around 7 million years. And the unique thing about these elephants is 7 million years is much longer than a normal geologic lifespan for most mammals. This elephant lived so long that it was able to not only, be its own species on its own environment, but it actually was able to evolve within that environment. So you still had productum, but then you had other species start to, branch off, like Rhynchotherium and eventually Columbian mammoths and mastodons and Cuviornis and all of the most famous mammoths that we know today. They all came from this one animal. And so that's one of the stories that I'm trying to tell with my research. Another story I'm trying to tell.
Hold on, can I ask a couple questions on the
Sure.
elephant because I am very, very curious. Now, the reason why it survived so long, was that based on whether its climate is, its size? Was it based on the fact, like the way you kind of described it, made it seem like the ancestor of all these other off breeds
Yeah.
that we have? And what's interesting is, you probably wouldn't expect me to go to this, but with a lot of people that talk about dinosaurs, let's talk about the T-Rex. I'm more interested in the little subspecies, the things that ended up, depending on its location, whether it was in Africa or whether it was in North America, had developed maybe the same type of species, but technically they're not, because they developed different traits based on the climate and the temperament it had to do to survive there, which is fucking fascinating, because
It
that
is.
leads down into a whole nother category of, why do birds in this area look like this when they look different over here? Then next thing you know, that just creates a chain reaction where the things that are being born, it's whatever, it's, I wouldn't say its ancestors, its predecessors, the ones following down below it, end up being completely different and unique, which is why we have like different types of birds. It doesn't have to be
Hmm.
so different as to have maybe, let's just say a hummingbird. There's different types of hummingbirds where their beaks are completely different, and that's just based on what
Exactly. Yeah.
the types of nutrition or whatever it needs to get to be able to feed itself to sustain life or survive. And the way you just described was with the elephant being an ancestor. That's an important fucking thing, because back then, like, everyone correlates mankind as we're the tough and we survived. We got lucky feeding off of things that were dead, getting scavenged
Yep.
stuff. And so we were able to develop tools. But there were other things out there like this. And one of my favorites, the megatherium, which is like the giant sloth. Like, this shit's like, imagine if that was around today. Like, the funny thing is, the way you're talking about how being able to kind of, even diving in the realm of paleontology, saying it's not that old. This is something I would like to fund a lot of the research into, because
Hmm.
as much as we like to say we know dinosaurs, we know this, we really haven't scratched the surface. We found a bunch of
Haven't even
giant
begun.
proof of evidence, and then we ran with it and said, here you go, and tossed it at people thinking, well, that's all to discover. No, it's not. There's a lot more. And the funny thing is, the more we discover, the more we'll be able to clone and be able to recreate these to actually have them at one point in our time.
Yeah, I'm really happy that you brought that up. One of the things, touching back on the bird beaks, I think Darwin's finches, for any of the viewers that might be out there, if you want to see an example of different what he was talking about with different
My name
beak
is Robbie.
sizes, as a yeah, Rob, sorry, Robbie. What Robbie was talking about with different beak sizes because of different diets, we can actually see that in the Galapagos Islands. And that was one of Darwin's first theories of why evolution actually fit, was he was able to see that these animals were filling different niches, and as a result of that, you're actually seeing physiological changes within their own body structure, which I think is really fascinating. But the other thing you touched on that I really want to go more in depth in is cloning mammoths and bringing back extinct species, because we are in a really unique time right now where we have the potential to bring back extinct species, but we need to find extinct species in order to do that. So one of the few things holding us back from being able to clone a mammoth tomorrow is, A, we lack the computing power to resequence a genetic code that is fragmentary, because the second an animal dies, even if you still have a
Yeah.
flesh mummy of this animal, the DNA still begins to degrade. Now, if we had something like quantum computing, then we would be able to reconstruct that that DNA in a very quick time frame. However, natural scientists don't quite have access to the quantum computing that Google has right now. But if there was a partnership, who knows? It's possible. The other thing that would allow us to do that is finding an intact cell. Now, the hard thing about finding an intact cell is you need one of these for cloning. But most of the well-preserved fossils that we find, well, not fossils, but frozen mammoths that we find, don't have any actual intact cells, even though you may have the whole body standing there. Now, the reason why that is because when cells freeze, they explode. And so that's why we haven't been able to clone them yet. But as I stated before, with the advances in quantum computing, once they start, connecting with natural scientists, I mean, my guess is it'll probably be the South Koreans who end up bringing back the first mammoth. But once they start funding that type of research, it'll be very quick before we start to see Asian elephant mammoth hybrids. And there's some really interesting projects going on in Siberia right now where they're trying to bring back an extinct environment from the Pleistocene
Planetarium
period.
Park, or is that what they're called?
Pleistocene Park, yeah. Yeah, and so that's something we will very likely see in our lifetimes. But climate change actually plays into this factor quite a bit as well, because of the rapid warming event that's going on right now and all of the permafrost across all of the northern hemisphere and all of the western hemisphere. What we have is these animals that are getting exposed and then rotting away. And if we miss our window of opportunity to collect as much biological samples from these frozen animals as we can, it may set us back indefinitely when it comes to trying to recreate these species. So I completely agree. We really need to start funding specifically Pleistocene research really extensively in areas like the Yukon, Alaska, Siberia, northern Norway, etc. Yeah.
Well, also, when people say, like, studying paleontology too, everyone thinks you have to go and get the paleontology degree, but they don't even consider the fields that go out there and do the work too. Just average people that are fossil hunting. I had talked to a woman who studied ichthyosaurs, and she was talking about how many of, like, the rocks that shift makes it very difficult to find a good, like, intact piece. And if you look at with climate change and everything that's going on too, with the fact that we're basically more worried about space than worried about what's here that we haven't even really discovered yet. Everything's shifting. Sooner or later, something's going to fall in the ocean that could be of prior importance, and we're not going to be able to have that research because we don't even want to go down there to try and find it out. My fear, because I will have to throw in something dumb here, is the fact of Meg. I don't want that ever in God's name. That can stay under there for the rest of its life.
Not a big fan of this guy, are you?
I'm not that is a mouth of a bus. That is not a thing. Nope, I'm good. It's a $5 footlong, probably fill that up. But no, it's like, if you look at how we're really kind of neglecting a lot of the important information that's here. I mean, the reason why cryptozoology is a thing is there's 9.6 billion or million species left undiscovered. I think 4 of it is on land and the rest is in the sea. It's like, you understand, like, people are like, how is that possible? Because there's different variations of things. They might all stem from one ancestor, but there's an importance of why there's that specific variation. It had to adapt to survive. I mean, when you look at the movie Ice Age, for instance, I'll toss out that movie. It's a good ass movie. But
it's a great movie.
There is so many important things in there where kids are looking at it like, is that real? Because all they focus on in everything that happens to do with paleontology is the T-Rex or the major Triceratops or something. What about this period of time where there might have been man and beast all at the same time trying to fight for survival, and then there's just this freeze where there's literally these monsters or creatures or amazing, whatever you want to call it, that are legit frozen, and we can't find a way to be able to fund our money for research into that, to be able to maybe recreate something that could even be as close as to a living dinosaur. Instead, we're like, well, I want to try and do a T-Rex because that's cooler. Why is that cooler? I would love to see a woolly mammoth or a saber-toothed tiger. Are you kidding me? Imagine having that as a pet. That's a fucking show-off pet.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring this up because I'm actually not a huge fan of bringing back T-Rex either. First of all, I don't think it's possible. Second of all, I don't think it's ethical. And third of all,
Have you seen Meet the Robinsons? It didn't go well.
It's not going to go well. I mean, its arms are too small and it's too large. I mean, imagine trying to feed that thing. We would end up eating them. I'm sure it would taste like a giant chicken. That's what would happen, is we would end up eating the Rex. But anyway, I'm glad you bring this up because there's been this crusade by Museum of the Rockies, the former founder of that, Jack Horner, to try to reverse engineer chicken DNA to try to get dinosaurian traits. Now, I mean, I get where he's saying, because what he's trying to do is he's trying to disable the enablers that allow different traits to grow or not grow. So just like we have junk code in a game that's been like modded, we have that junk code within our DNA, right? So we have parts of our DNA that are disablers that keep us from growing a bunch of hair like some of our old, ape ancestors. It keeps us from, having splayed toes, for example. But you're not going to be able to get an early hominid just by messing with somebody's DNA to that extent. All you're going to do is mess with the quality of life for that individual, similar to how you would mess with the quality of life for those chickens.
Yeah.
I'm sure PETA is not a big fan of what Jack Horner is doing, but I think a lot of the research focused on bringing back extinct species from the Pleistocene has a lot of a solid basis to it. Now, one of the interesting things about that is we've actually managed to bring back several species of extinct plants that have been frozen in Siberia. So we're able to do that. We have crossed the threshold where we have brought back extinct species. We just need to find a way to do it with
a larger scale.
With a larger scale, yeah. And we need to find it in a way where these animals can breed. Now, that's the difficult part. So, you have an Asian elephant mammoth hybrid. How are you going to get it to the point where that's a viable species and not just a clone? How are you going to make that animal fertile? That's
Like
what I don't know, because I'm not a geneticist, but still.
Kind of like how we have horses and donkeys, for instance, make a mule. The mules
Exactly.
can't rebreed because their sperm is just blank cells. I mean, if you're going to spend so much time and research into trying to clone something, at least wanting to be able to reproduce it again without having to go through just, here's this thing, when it dies, it dies. It's like seeing a rhino that, no, it's too old to mate. So it's like the last of its species is going to die. There's got to be a way to genetically modify it, but that's what it creates kind of an issue, because if you try and take cells from something else, let's say if you take cells from a woolly mammoth or take some of its gene code and try and put it into an elephant to be able to adapt it into whatever, maybe a baby that's going to be born or a little mammal that's going to be born, it's not exactly the same thing. It just might be a new species that you created. It's kind of like a bulldog. It's a man-made thing that will end up probably having more defects because we're just not capable of really recreating life that isn't, besides maybe plant, because its genetic code is different. But if you look at like trying to recreate the dinosaurs, it's something that we feel like, oh, we'll get there in 10 years. Not at the rate we're going. We're not even going to be close, because the fact is you have to replicate emotion. You have to replicate so much other things that we don't even understand a second into our brain.
Yeah, I think a lot of that stuff can be replicated through the cloning process. I mean, we're not going to have an animal that's like mentally deficient. It'll still be able to do its thing. You might have a few that are mentally deficient at first, but generally speaking, what they're able to do now is they're able to actually take clone. In South Africa, there's a service where very rich people, I'm talking millionaires to billionaires, can actually go and get their dogs cloned. Now, the interesting thing about that is when their dogs die, they're able to get them cloned. However, their personalities are always different. So I think that in itself is evidence that we are able to have to create through the cloning process animals that have functioning cognition. Yeah. But I just don't know how that would play out on a grander scale. It's possible, but elephants are also some of the most intelligent of animals. So who knows? Who knows? But either way, it would be interesting to see what played out. I would also like to see some of the extinct species of bison be brought someday. Seeing a bison priscus in person, or bison latifrons, would be a personal dream of mine.
Those are, to me, probably the best options, only because of the fact of how safe it is to probably do so. You don't really have to worry about anything freaking out or needing a massive scale of feeding. I mean, if you look at Jurassic World or any of those movies, they show a blueprint of what not to do. You bring it back the major ones, and then you start experimenting on the huge, monstrous ones that we all know about. But what about just the passive aggressive? I would be more than happy to pay $25 a ticket to go to a zoo that has an extinct form of bison or anything of that sort. It makes more sense.
That'd be super cool. Yeah, and actually bringing these animals back into their environments is very good for the biodiversity of the environment. Here in South Dakota, here in the Black Hills where I live, I'm about 20 minutes from Wind Cave National Park, right here in Hot Springs, where the World Fossil Finders Museum is. And there we actually have a preserved ecosystem. So they've put bison back into the ecosystem, they put prairie dogs back into the ecosystem, and the change is so palatable. You can see, when you're driving into fenced off prairies lacking all bison, you can see how the environment is just dead all around it. There is not very much life going on anywhere. But on Wind Cave National Park, where you have large megafauna changing their environments, you have different species everywhere. It's a practical cornucopia. These animals, they really drastically change the landscape they're in, and it can't be understated how much we actually have changed the environment by killing off the bison herds and killing off the mammoth herds. Now, a lot of my research with the University of New Mexico is focused on small rodents from the last 22,000 years, specifically pocket gophers. And I'll be presenting this research next year. But the cool thing about these pocket gophers is these animals keep a record through their body size of how the environment's doing, because gophers don't inherit their body size from their parents. They get their body size purely based on how well they're doing in their environment. So by looking at a perfect record of the last 22,000 years and putting a body mass regression by looking at dental tooth row lengths of these pocket gophers, I'm actually able to see how the loss of the megafauna starting around 16,000 years ago in the Pleistocene defaunation event, or the beginning of the Anthropocene defaunation event, whatever you prefer, you can actually see how rigidly the environment these animals lived in, how it's affected. You see different species of grass take over the plains. You see trees actually start to colonize areas they wouldn't normally colonize, because large bison herds and large mammoth herds would always tramp them down. You start to see fires becoming a more significant issue because megafauna help get rid of the brush that's in the ground. They compact everything,
A good example is kind of like what you're saying,
yeah.
is being able to kind of categorize or be able to log by using the dental records. It shows
Mm-hmm.
the growth of what was able to happen at that time. When you mentioned at gophers, their size depends on the area that they're involved in. It's kind of like when you have a little bait fish and you put it in a tank. Depending on how much room that thing has to grow, it'll grow pretty freaking huge. I'm just making sure I'm understanding what's being said here.
No, you're exactly right. And so imagine that fish being in a beautiful pond, and then you take away all sorts of other animals that fish would coexist with. And as a result of that, what we're seeing is the changes in that fish's physiology when those animals are no longer interacting with the environment that they find themselves in.
If you would have to pick out of, even if it's a rodent or anything prehistoric that would be, I guess, more compatible or cooperative with the times that we're living in this world, which would you pick to say? Because I mean, like, I feel like if the megatherium didn't die out, I don't care how savage they were, but I'm like, they make tunneling systems that would make so much of that easier and cleaner and more effective with using it as a tool, or maybe something like a partnership. I mean, we're practically fungus or parasites. People are. We spread like mad cow disease. I'm just saying, instead of having a fucking crane or a bulldozer create a hole in the ground, we got to dig a moat. Okay, well, here's Johnny. He's a megatherium and he's going to dig it for us. And it's going to be all we got to do is feed him a carrot.
That would be cool. That would be cool. And I think the animals you're thinking of with the giant burrows are actually not the sloths. I think they're the glyptodonts, the giant armadillos that are the size of a Volkswagen Bug. Those are the
I'm
ones
talking
that
about
make...
the huge sloth, dude, is megatherium. Apparently, they dug tunnels and used their claws to do so, because at the bottom
Oh,
feet
I guess
part
I
were
didn't know
curved.
that. Oh,
I used to do the reason why I picked that
not
one
a big sloth guy.
specifically is because I knew as soon as I saw Futurama, where they invited the episode with the dinosaurs, I was like, what is
Love that
that
episode.
sloth? I have to find that.
Oh, there's another one you should check out. It's called Arematherium. It's even bigger than Megatherium and Megalonyx. Now, this guy was actually discovered by the founder of the museum I'm currently at, Frank Garcia in Florida. And the Arematherium, I mean, a Megatherium claw is about this big, and a Arematherium claw is about this big. So it's It's gigantic, man. This big for just one claw. I'll have to shoot you a picture as soon as
It's
we get
like
off of this.
it's like a pet store where they're like, "Do you want an extra large dog, a large dog, or a small dog?" And you're like, "What's the difference between a large and an extra large?" About 55 pounds. You're like, "Oh shit, really?"
Or a few tons in this case.
Yeah.
Yeah, these animals are pretty wild. One of the things that's cool that we've been learning a lot more about lately, some new research is starting to come out of South Africa, which you might find fascinating. So what we're starting to learn more about is the Permian Triassic mass extinction event. Now, this was actually the worst mass extinction in Earth's history, and up until about last year, we didn't really know what caused it. Now, this happened around 215 million years ago during the time of Pangaea. So I'm sure you're familiar. Pangaea was
Yeah.
when Earth was all one continent, and it had huge sweeping deserts because when you're one continent, you don't.
Just to make sure I'm right here, I tossed out a theory. I think that the reason why like cultures are so important, but also how it's weird if you look at geographically how every country has kind of separately evolved as a species, mostly in the way that they find immoral values depending on where they're from. Isn't Pangea, since we broke apart and we're slowly drifting farther and farther apart every single year by like a small minuscule amount, at one point, maybe a million, 100 million years from now, that we're going to recollide just in the opposite way?
Um, Not necessarily. I don't think we'll ever get technical Pangea again. Essentially, what's happening is we have plate tectonic boundaries that are diverging and converging. So, for example, during the age of the dinosaurs, Europe and North America, or what would have been the eastern continent of North America, known as Appalachia, in the late Cretaceous period, were actually a lot closer together. And this is because these two plates, one of them that's for the North America and the other one that's for Europe, are diverging. And so what we're seeing there, and the reason why we have this massive ocean, is because these plates are going away from each other. And every time they go away, you're actually seeing magma come up and form new land in the bottom of the ocean, which is really cool. If you ever look at a geological map of the ocean, you'll be able to see this happening. You'll be able to see all of the basalt in the middle of it that separated these two areas. And that's why we find dinosaurs in Europe, like iguanodon, that are very similar to some Appalachian dinosaurs that have been found in New Jersey, for example. So I don't think we'll ever get back to Pangaea, but we will continue to see the continents and plate structure of Earth continue to evolve at a rather quick geological pace. But for us, it might as well even be non-existent. But we will see, more mountain ranges form. We will see more continents, come together or go apart. For example, South America used to be connected with Africa. We can actually see some rift events taking place today. If we look at, the Iberian Peninsula, and then we look at, well, not Iberian, but if we look at Saudi Arabia and we look at the other parts of Africa, you can actually see that
Yeah,
whole area
they
is
all look like puzzle
literally
pieces that kind of broke apart. It seems like if you pushed them
exactly,
back
yeah.
together, I'm not saying push them back together like this, but if we're all separating farther and farther apart, I mean, the globe is a circle. All right, flat earthers, don't get mad at me, but it's a circle. So if it comes back around, it would just hit the outer edges and crash in instead of coming back in towards the middle, which is I was thinking. But even with all the shifting in tectonic plates, everything that's being involved with just how the environment's just rapidly changing. It seems like our Earth is literally reforming itself 24/7. And nobody's even really paying attention to it besides someone like yourself that's actually.
Oh, it's a massive change. The reason why I brought up the Permian Triassic mass extinction event is because it was caused by a Siberian supervolcano exploding and shooting tons of carbon dioxide and methane into the Earth's atmosphere. And then it spit lava for several 100,000 years. And the lava went directly on top of some of the biggest coal seams in the world. So as a result of that, all of this carbon dioxide was released into the Earth's atmosphere that caused a greenhouse effect that was even more rapid as a result of all the methane being released into the Earth's atmosphere, and it caused a massive die out of over 80% of life in the oceans and over 80% of life on land. And what we're actually seeing today is a very similar occurrence to that. So studying the Triassic, the first era of the Mesozoic era, which is the first age of the dinosaurs, will actually let us understand what kind of environment our world is moving into, which, to be quite frank with you, is a little bit terrifying to me, because I've dug in the Triassic and I've dug in the Permian, and it's not a very good place to live. I mean, the dirt's red like hell.
I think if we look at like the fact of what's the scariest to lose, people are like, well, what happens if Earth's just not capable for us to live anymore? I'm like, I think the biggest fact is that we're losing information on a daily basis that we're never going to be able to even know what it was, or we don't even really know we lost it, but it's there being lost. I mean, things are being broken up. I mean, would you say that fossils or types of information like historic finds, like in museums or something, are being more common, or would you say they're being less common?
I would say we're actually undergoing a renaissance in paleontology today. Even despite the fact that the United States funds natural history museums, the lowest of all arts institutions in this country, which is quite unfortunate. That's both political parties do that, unfortunately. We're actually still seeing a resurgence of new data being collected. Now, that's because we have access in the digital age to new ways of collecting this technology. For example, we can now do something that's called stable isotopic analysis. It's something that I've done quite a bit in the past, and that is one of the best ways to get data that we never even thought existed from bones. So what I can do through stable isotopic analysis is I can take Mayan teeth, for example, which is what I did at UNM. I took human Mayan teeth
How
from
dare
the
you?
archaic. But what can I say? That's archaeology for you. I'm forever cursed. But you take Mayan teeth and then you take a Dremel and then you grind down all of the enamel, being careful not to get to the dentine. And once you get the enamel, you get it on a little wax paper that almost looks like a little gum wrapper, and you run it through a centrifuge. And once you run it through a centrifuge, then you're able to actually purify it. And then once you get a pipette and purify it again, then I can send it off to something called a mass spectrometer. Now, the mass spectrometer is really cool because what this thing does is separates the isotopes within that sample. And so it can give us a ratio of what's actually going on. So with a strontium isotope, for example, I can determine the unique water source that this particular animal persisted on for its entirety of its life. Because each different water source in the world has a different strontium isotopic signature. If I was doing stable isotopic research on predators, for example, if I wanted to understand which trophic level this animal was on, which is a fancy way of saying which ladder on the food chain this animal occupies, I would be able to look at the nitrogen ratio within it, and that would tell me what kind of prey this animal's persisting upon. Now, I can also determine that with herbivores as well. We can actually look at the carbon isotopes and we can determine whether this animal was eating carbon-3 plants, carbon-4 plants, or CAM plants. And each one of the CAMs are like succulents and stuff. Yeah. You can actually determine the unique diet of these animals. Some of the other cool methods we can use is we can actually get very strong microscopes, and we can zoom way in on the teeth of these animals, like a mastodon or a gomphothere, for example, and then we can get microwear data on them. So single thing we eat actually leaves a unique micro scratch on our teeth. So I could go and look at your teeth under an electron microscope, and I would see different scratches on that teeth as opposed to my teeth, because we come from two different parts of the United States, and we probably have somewhat different diets as a result
Let me
of
say,
that.
my mouth's pretty fucked up. You would be seeing not tiny scratches, you'd be seeing chips.
Oh, no worries, man. Mine too. I'm a chain smoker. What can I say?
Mine was I got hit with a bat when I was little, and that thing, yeah, that'll predate that. No, well, if we could look at, so if we're able to figure out what diets they have now, can that end up leading into figuring out why maybe that certain type of species is a different variant from the same species? Like they always talk about, like, oh, if you eat this, it'll help your hair nice and whatever. Depending on your location, like we know about the melanin theory, which is that people in Africa have developed darker shades of skin to be able to help with sunlight because it's a hotter climate there. People in Ireland have lighter skin, which makes them burn because they have less melanin in their skin. That could be the same thing with the type of diets that they're having. Once you figure out which classifications or plant categories they are eating in, you're able to figure out, hey, maybe this is why this same species developed like this because it was feeding off of this diet.
Yeah, so you bring up a really great point there. And yeah, the diets of animals can completely change how these animals behave. And a perfect example, I can't even really think of a more of a better example than us. So the reason why we evolved brains the size of our current brain, the reason why we're intelligent, the reason why we're so successful today, even though we've only been around for like 300,000 years, which as a paleontologist, I wouldn't consider that successful. But anyway, we evolved all of this because we were able to exploit a omega-3 and very fatty food source that was not really accessible to too many other animals on the savannah. So what we did is we were actually able to get stone tools, and we were able to break open bones to get to the marrow within. Because when you're a scavenger in the savannah, that is pretty much all that's left after the vultures, the hyenas, and the lions get to whatever they're eating. And so because of that, we're able to, get this omega-3 diet that's very rich in omega-3 fatty acids, which are directly linked to brain growth. And as a result of this, very fatty, very, very, very nutritious diet, I'm sure stem cells and bones had something to do with it too, but there hasn't been a whole lot of research. It's just a guess of mine, an educated guess, but a guess nonetheless. Because of this, we are actually able to become intelligent. So that's a perfect example of how a specific food source can actually directly correlate to things like brain growth, or things like a better coat, or things like
Well, hold on. Since I am
yeah.
an honest man, I will toss out that the podcast I did with Dr. Karen Bellinger, who told me that humans were scavengers. That's where the information came from. I know I might have caught you off guard with seeming how smart I might be, but I just want to toss that credit out there. But seriously, though, if we look at so much the world still has left to offer, and we feel like we kind of mastered the whole code. Do you think that at any point that people are going to shift in thinking of maybe we should try recreating things? Because sooner or later, polar bears are going to be this type of thing that's going to be extinct. I mean, we're losing species almost every single day,
Oh yeah.
at alarming rates, and it's stuff that we're not even paying attention to. Like, I think the most important part about this, and most importantly, what about you do, not only being able to catalog and be able to research and first of all understand these things, is also being able to educate people of why the dinosaurs, the T-Rex, all these type of things, they're important, but they're small chess pieces in a very, very large game. There's other things out there that are more important and more viable that we're going to be able to see sooner rather than later if we focus on those rather than the giant ones we always talk about.
So I think you bring up a lot of really good points there. First thing I would say though is I actually kind of disagree with the fact that dinosaurs are considered insignificant. Now, dinosaurs actually persisted for almost 300 million years. So if we compare dinosaurs with us, barely been around for 300,000, dinosaurs are the most successful land animals to ever exist. Period.
Yeah, they live
So
for over 60 million years, but
yeah.
what I categorize as the priority of what we should be researching as things that are being able to help sustain and maybe create even a balance more in our lives rather than just creating giant monsters that we wouldn't be able to know how to control but keep them locked up. That doesn't seem like beneficial.
Yeah. So the paleontology research that holds the most value to people like us, trying to understand the current mass extinction event and how to deal with this and grow from this, is something I touched on my last podcast that I did with Rich Conversations. But basically, understanding how these environments have changed and shifted in the past. So for example, understanding how Earth healed from the Permian Triassic mass extinction, for example, will allow us to understand how maybe we could even expedite that process in our own environment. Because right now there's no really turning the tide to go back to how it was. No matter what, we're already past the carbon parts per million that allow us to maintain our current temperature change. We're probably going to see 3 to 6 degrees of temperature change within that. But understanding how this has occurred in the past and how we can, use that information to learn from the present is important. For example, the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum event occurred 55 million years ago. This was a massive warming event, nowhere on par with our current warming event or with the Permian Triassic mass extinction. However, it did cause a lot of issues that we can see in the fossil record. One of the most fascinating of these issues is it caused something that I think we're seeing today with the red tide. Now, they've done core samples and studied, some of the cores off the eastern seaboard and determined that after this rapid warming event, that all of the oceans kind of became a dead zone close to the coast for about 50 miles. And that was a result of temperature change in the ocean that allowed algae to bloom. So understanding how that occurred in the fossil record will allow us to understand how to better combat that in the future, because it's something we see every year and it's only going to become a bigger issue in the future. And not too many people are talking about it. Another thing is, of course, some of the defaunation research that we're doing here at the Smith Lab in New Mexico, and that's looking at how these environments have been affected by the loss of megafauna, how these environments change. And understanding how that change occurs can actually show us how we can further change the environment for our favor. Also looking at the geological record will show us which areas will probably be more inhabitable in the future than areas that are currently inhabitable now. So in the Eocene period and in the Oligocene period, Antarctica was actually a rainforest. So we're going to start to see, it's wild. You've even had dinosaurs living in Antarctica. Rainforest.
Was a rainforest.
It's a trip, isn't it?
Doesn't make any sense, to be 100% honest with you.
It'll happen again, man. It'll happen again. These warming events, they really drastically change.
Is that closer than, it seems like Yellowstone is a big concern for some people on the aspect that it might blow because it's been about 600,000 years since 600,000 is, I think, the number.
Yeah, I think something like that. I'm not a volcanologist per se, but I am pretty fascinated by the Yellowstone thing because I live in the Black Hills and we would be definitely part of the initial blast radius.
I think everybody but Africa would probably be in like nuclear winter.
Yeah. The interesting thing about that is if we got nuclear winter, that might actually offset some of the warming processes that are currently going on.
So people can still drive their diesel trucks.
There you go.
You
maybe
hooked
we'll
them.
Just have to light it up. And then maybe Democrats will win more elections. I couldn't help myself. Not that I'm getting political, and not that I'll say I stand on either side, but if you lose the Midwest, what can I say? But I think if Yellowstone did happen, it is overdue. However, geologically speaking, that means it could happen now. It could happen in 10,000 years. It could happen tomorrow. We don't know what could happen. All we know is we have to follow what's going on in the seismology there. So I actually get alerts on my phone every time there's an earthquake there, just because I'm fascinated by it. And if you see anything that's over 4.0, that's when you should be worried, because that's evidence of pretty significant geological activity there. However, we haven't really seen any earthquakes that are over 4.0. So it's when you start seeing stuff like 6s and 7s and 8s going on.
Basically, to quote Robin Williams, When
That's when I'll be moving to Iceland.
to quote Robin Williams, when your cat spread eagle in the doorway screaming, "Get the fuck out," it's probably time to move locations.
Exactly, yeah. Trust me, if it's gonna blow, we're going to know. Like it'll be an issue. But
That
who
needs to be
knows, man?
put on a
2020 isn't
shirt.
over yet. It might be December.
Tim, you need to put that on a shirt. When it blows, you will know. Would you
Yeah, that would be a
consider,
good one.
for people that are maybe interested in learning a little bit more, and first of all, I mean, taking the time to go to a museum, which how I know with the pandemic and everything too, I know a lot of people are talking about how it seems like a lot of them are going to be closing permanently just on the
Yeah,
aspect of things, or turning
it's
into a
really
virtual
sad.
thing, which really sucks because as much as
Does.
it would be cool to go virtual reality into like an Anne Frank museum or be able to see a dinosaur on a computer, it's not the same as seeing it in person. It's something where you want to go there and actually be in the presence of where you could feel like history has been involved. And would you do you think that it's going to go back to the way it was, or maybe take a new form?
Um, quite frankly, I'm not optimistic about the future of our museum institutions in this country. I've worked at a lot of the larger institutions in this country, and I can tell you, I've seen the books personally. They were in the red in 2012 and like 2015 and stuff when we were doing well in our economy. And they were already the lowest funded public institutions in this country before COVID-19. So with people leaving areas like New York City, massive tax bases leaving, places like Los Angeles, New York, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, Las Vegas, Phoenix, you name it, large metropolitan areas are now emptying out. As a result of this, we're going to see even less funding, less visitors coming in. One of the things I'm really worried about right now is the lack of events that are put on in natural history museums and how much that impacts the bottom line of these museums, because a lot of these museums have adapted to try to like deal with this new paradigm where the government does not fund paleontology like they did in antiquity in the early 19th century. And what they do is they make a lot of their money off of conferences. The Denver Museum, for example, has a conference center right inside the museum, and the museum functions as not only a natural history museum, but an event venue as well. So the loss of live events is a huge, huge, huge hit to natural history museums. The fact that state budgets are going to have to be cut across the board. I mean, there's blood in the streets when it comes to the finances of every state in the country except for like North Dakota, who can function without government aid for a year and a half. We're going to see things like, for example, the New Mexico Museum of Natural History is funded by the state of New Mexico, but the state of New Mexico's entire unemployment insurance just ran out. They just ran out of money. So I honestly feel like museums are going to get the chopping block when tourism is down and they need to fund things like public utilities and garbage cleanup. They're going to really cut out a lot of this. I don't really know where the future holds, but I'm kind of worried about it. I have colleagues at the Field Museum. They laid off 25% of their workforce. I have friends that worked at the American Museum. One of them was hired as a preparator. They laid him off, which was terrible because they hired him like 2 months prior to the pandemic. And he moved up across the nation to move to Manhattan as a result of that. I'm not optimistic, but I think it really is, that's where we as Americans come in, and that's where we as people who are interested in paleontology come in, because we have to really start beating the bush to get people out into museums. Say, yes, you can go to a natural history museum and not get COVID. Just wear your mask, just social distance. In fact, this is the best time to go to the museum because you can go and look at something like the Hope Diamond and not have 50 people all around you. You can go and actually have an intimate experience and see Sue. Like when I was in Chicago 2 months ago, I was able to go and look at Sue, the T-Rex, and I was the only one in the room. So for me, I feel like we should talk about some of the positive aspects of that and how there's more learning to be done. And I think now more than ever, we need to really get online and start screaming from the
That's
rooftops.
literally what the best.
Paleontology is so cool.
That's the best route for anybody that is like yourself that can use social media to be able to show people that, hey, there's this that you guys are missing on. I mean, the interesting part about Instagram is the fact of it's a mostly like, oh, pretty picture, swipe, double tap. So people follow pages that post really interesting stuff. Well, not more of content when it comes to like, here's a fact of the dictionary or something, more on the fact of something that's very appealing to their eyes. Sadly, a lot of that's fucking food. People go insane when they see a burger that's like dipped in chocolate, dripping with grease, where it's like diabetes is the cell content of that. But when people see a dinosaur, much like yourself, like doing this video and then having that in the background behind you is a huge thing because everyone's going to see that, be like, holy shit, where is that? What is that? That's what needs to be brought out there through social media, which is important with your page.
Yeah, so this is Debbie Sue. This is the largest tylosaur, well, the second largest ever discovered. It's real bone. Its skull is over 90% complete, and it's the best mosasaur mount in the entire world. So
imagine finding a fucking exhibit that's like 99.9% complete, and we're like, it's always that 0.1. Nobody can ever narrow down the 0.1.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to keep all the bones together. It's very rare to. I don't even know of one animal that's 100% complete. I'm sure they exist. I haven't found one. I mean, the skeleton of this animal is around 40% complete. However, the skull is 90. And if you're going to have anything complete on a mosasaur, it's going to be the skull. It's kind of cool. You can see this animal is actually closely related to Komodo dragons. It actually has a third eye on top of its head, just like Komodo dragons. And it has jointed jaws. Now, that's the cool thing about mosasaurs is these animals were able to kind of swallow their prey with their jaws and expand them, just like modern day snakes. This animal was living in the western interior seaway of Edgemont, South Dakota, around 70 million years ago. And I can tell you right now, it's one of the most charismatic marine reptiles.
And honestly, look like it's smiling at me a little bit. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah, Debbie Sue, she's quite friendly. The Lakota people who actually live in Pine Ridge, who are the indigenous people who lived in this region, actually found bones of mosasaurs, and they actually have a myth talking about them. So there's a myth of Inchecula, which is this large serpent being that goes and terrorizes the different people of the plains. And then this brave hero kills it and takes its heart. And this animal's bones become brittle and covered with crystal. And then it dies in this black rock. And you find pure shell mosasaurs in black rock covered in gypsum crystals.
And
so
the Moses thing is like mosaics, kind of. That's what it's supposed to reference. Okay, that's funny because I'm a big religion kind of mythos, I would say, nerd, and I've read that when I was a little kid. There's a great, first of all, museums are great information. You want to know what I got a lot of my good mythology education from? Comics called Graphic Universe. They had those in my school. I finally figured out what the name is, and I will preach their guidance throughout everything because they taught me so much about this type of stuff. That's what makes interesting or makes learning fun, is when you can make it interesting like that, but you have to adapt it to a new form. Sadly, you can't really experience that when it comes through virtual reality or something like that. It makes it easier to go to because obviously, but if you can see it, I recommend it for most people out there listening, like going to a museum. Like I got to start doing that more. Or, I mean, we don't have a lot close by, but let me tell you something. Like I neglected those so much as a kid that
What part of the country are you in?
I'm in Maryland.
Oh, you're in Maryland. You got the Smithsonian right there, man. And you got the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philly.
Sadly, that's 3 hours away, and then the other one's 4 hours away.
Oof.
So I'm like, I gotta just, say, hey, work. There's other things that are more important. I want to be able to fly in the simulator that they have at the Air and Space Museum.
That's cool. That's really cool.
In my grandma's words, she did not have a fun time when I was 14 and they gave me the joystick to be able to fly it because I flipped us immediately upside down and she's screaming like crazy.
It's hilarious. That reminds me of something we used to have at the Mexican Museum. It was like a drive your own dinosaur thing. It was
There you
wild.
go. Look, we got Disney World. People love that place. Let's do that with amusement parks. Let's make it like a track where you sit in a little buggy and they take you all the way around the thing.
Oh, that's the thing. Yeah, let's turn museums into amusement parks of learning. Yeah, just make it massive and oh, come check out this. Come ride the mosasaur, whatever. That would be so cool.
Like kind of
But
like
that's just me.
kind of like Jurassic World, where you're able to kind of drive around, but instead you get it's like kind of autopiloted for you, and it just moves you around on a track, being able to check out the whole museum, so nobody gets lost. You're in a cart, social distanced, and we'll include the bathrooms outside because nobody wants you getting messy on the inside.
No, there are some cool museums that have a similar aspect to that in them. So I actually got my first internship at the Wyoming Dinosaur Center in Thermopolis. And the cool thing about this museum is it has dig sites right at the museum. Like the museum is here, and then they have bone beds like 5 minutes away. So what they do is you'll come in and you'll do a dig for a day program, and they'll actually take you through the whole museum. They'll take you and you'll watch like a documentary on Morrison Formation sauropods, which is Jurassic long neck dinosaurs. And then they'll actually take you to go dig them up in the field right there. So there are some museums that have some interesting ways of scientific communication. Two Medicine Dinosaur Center and the Mammoth Site are another examples of museums quite like that.
Well, Tim, you've gave shout outs to everybody but yourself, man. Please promote where people can find your content at, brother.
Yeah, so you guys can follow me on Instagram at DinoGuy1997. Shoot me a message if you have any questions. I'm always happy to tell anybody whether or not it's a fossil. Shoot me a random rock that you think might be a dinosaur egg. I'll tell you whether or not it is. Follow me on that. In the future, I'll be starting up a YouTube channel, but that's down the line. So yeah, just follow me on Instagram and hit me up if y'all have any questions about dinosaurs, mammoths, Permian synapsids, etc.
Well, thank you for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank podcast, and stay tuned for our next episode.